today. For today's strategy session, we'll be discussing why a racial equity lens, by which we mean an understanding of and commitment to addressing the role of race and racism, is essential to implementing the science of learning and development. You can see from our panelist slide that we're going to be joined by some amazing humans with really impressive insight. Our first two panelists are going to share their expertise on what critical race theory and culturally affirming teaching really are, what they are not, and why they matter to the success of all young people. I want to arm you with that deep knowledge that they have. We're also joined by an amazing district leader who will provide his insights into how this is playing out on the ground and how it's impacting his efforts to lead for equity. Our conversation today will be led by a communications expert who will help us unpack all of this and also share some of her own insights and tips on how to effectively communicate about this issue. And part of our goal is to arm you with knowledge and insight so that you can help and continue to help in this work for equity. To begin, I do want to create a shared base of knowledge among us. Let's just a quick recap of what's going on. With gratitude to the African American Policy Forum and their Truth Be Told campaign, they've put together this map that tells us 23 states have introduced some form of gag order legislation with respect to racial justice, critical race theory, the teaching of racial injustice in American history. 9 states have fully passed some version of them. This is a big reversal from when we might have been talking about this issue 3-4 months ago, where we could have looked at a different map where there were initiatives moving in state capitals to advance equity. In many cases now we have initiatives moving against equity. What do those laws really do? There are basically 4 things that these laws are doing. In our next slide, we can tee them up. The first thing is some of them speak, they're in the wrong order. So the third one is there we go. Some of them speak to the issue of feelings. There are literally laws proposed in many of these states that prohibit anyone from making a student at a school feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. So one thing these laws do is go after feelings. Another thing is they go after anti-bias training and other equity efforts around diversity, inclusion, equity committees, hiring of equity officers, ongoing training for teachers to recognize and rid themselves of unconscious biases. So these are some things that are disallowed, outlawed by some of these pieces of legislation. The third thing they do is go after curriculum. They might prohibit courses on topics like Black and Latino studies. We've seen ethnic studies courses. The Texas law is one example, requires teachers to teach social studies without giving deference to any one perspective. So curriculum is a target here. And then discussions of oppression and privilege. Most of these bills would prohibit educators from teaching students that an individual, by virtue of the individual's race or sex, is inherently privileged, racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or subconsciously. This connects back to our feelings when at first we're pulling example language with the help of Ed Week from some of these bills to show you sort of what's going on across the country in these legislatures. So that is a basic state of play. These laws are real. They're being played out in legislatures across the country. They've been passed in many ways, in many states, and the ways in which they have a chilling effect is also real. But to unpack a little bit more about what this backlash is about and how it is playing out, let me hand things over to my friend and colleague, Ashley Burns, who's the director in the Seattle office of Browley Communications, and she will bring our panelists on screen as well, and they will all together take you into this discussion. So Ashley, I will hand it over to you, and welcome to Zaretta and Aaron and Francesca.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bethany. Thank you all for your time. As you might imagine, this is a tall task to cover in just under an hour. And so while you will hopefully get grounded, because we know there are a lot of lies out there, so this is a great opportunity for you to hear the truth. I also want to assure you that there is some good news in this discussion. So with that, let's start with Francesca Lopez, Waterbury Chair in Equity Pedagogy and Professor of Education at Penn State University. Francesca?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thumbs up if you can hear me, just to make sure my mic is okay. Great. I am honored to be part of this panel and engage with you all on this extremely important topic. I just wanted to start out by clarifying very briefly, there's too much to be said in the short amount of time, right? But what critical race theory is. It was developed in the 1970s by legal scholars like Derek Bell, who's known as the father of CRT, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, Richard Delgado, and many, many others who wanted to examine how racism produces and sustains inequality in laws. That's the essence of what it is. An example of its application would be Ian Haney Lopez, who was a student of Derek Bell's and now a law professor at Berkeley. He analyzed the Supreme Court case Hernandez versus Texas using CRT to demonstrate that it is not just race in and of itself that demands constitutional intervention, but rather race as subordination, right? So CRT came to the field of education thanks to Gloria Ladson-Billings and William Tate in the 1990s to enhance our understanding of educational disparities that were a result of racism. So to give everybody an example, right? Well, just about everybody knows about the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision that separate education could not be equal. Fewer people know that the court decision gave personnel decisions to white school district superintendents, and this in turn led to the firing of tens of thousands of Black teachers, right? And so since Ladson-Billings and Tate's introduction of CRT to education, many education researchers now use CRT as this theoretical and analytical tool to examine issues in education. So to be clear, it is not critical race theory that's actually being taught in schools, right? It's this analytical tool we tend to see in grad school. But there are things that are being taught in K-12 that we do need to understand and understand what the evidence behind these things actually is. Before I dive into the evidence, I did want to make two brief points about why we're seeing what we're seeing. So number one is this key issue we've seen in research, right? Where educators do not often get the specific knowledge and skills that they need to address achievement disparities in their classrooms. They just don't get it in their teacher education programs. It's rare, and scholars and researchers have lamented this for decades. Add to that the fact that we've seen this mounting response, right, to racial tensions, especially after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So collectively, you have this paucity of educators with specific knowledge that they need and this watershed moment in our history. And now here we are where we are, right? A lot more stuff going on in the background, but these are two very important issues that we have to keep in mind. So when I refer to essential knowledge, sometimes in education, it's called critical awareness or critical consciousness, and there's a lot to unpack here, but I'm going to summarize it for you in three very, very brief points. This critical awareness knowledge that teachers, educators, leaders need to have includes a deep understanding of the historical context of our marginalized students, the discrepancy between those who have experiences validated in their outcomes and those that do not in our classroom settings, and the ways the traditional curriculum tends to replicate the same disparities that we see in society, right? So this critical awareness allows educators to engage in what I collectively refer to as asset-based practices, asset-based pedagogy. And this in turn, through research, right, has shown us that it promotes student identity, learning, and a lot of other very, very important outcomes. So this framework that you're seeing on the screen right now undergirds what I refer to as asset-based pedagogy, which includes many terms. You can see some of the terms with some of the scholars' names. I've left out a lot. There's not enough space to see them all. But all these different asset-based approaches have these key things in common. So yes, there are nuances among them, but they all share the undergirding framework that educators need specific knowledge to engage in practices to address disparities, right? And so because of this, they actually do share two key themes with critical race theory. And that's number one, this deep understanding of the sources of disparities allows people then to call to action and actually change things that are producing and sustaining those inequities. So now turning, what does the research say about these asset-based practices? So through some of my own research, as well as others, I wanted to say I stand on the shoulders of giants, right? We know that the more a policy reflects asset views of students, the better the outcomes students have. I've cited a few of my research studies just as an example, but this is things like having policies in favor of bilingual or dual language education, in favor of ethnic studies. So there's also the same kind of research for practices in classrooms. All of those scholars that I mentioned in an earlier page, right? The studies are the same, that the more asset-based pedagogy that's happening in a classroom, the better the student outcomes. And the one key thing that all of these studies share is this critical awareness that educators develop and have that allows them to behave in certain ways in classrooms. And so because critical awareness is so instrumental, I wanted to spend a little more time on it to give you just a sense of one of the studies that I've done as to why it is so important that educators have this knowledge. So in a study where I had teachers along the continuum in terms of their expectations, we've often heard of self-fulfilling prophecies and having high expectations and how important that is. Well, teachers have varying degrees of expectations. And the issue in my study is that once I included students' prior achievement, expectations, high or low, did not help explain student achievement. And this core issue is one that has been a very contentious argument in psychology research. However, the picture changes dramatically the moment I included critical awareness. For teachers with low expectations and this low level of knowledge, we saw self-fulfilling prophecies play out, right? Students did not do better later on in school because the teachers didn't believe that they had the ability and they didn't have this key knowledge that they needed. Then we have the group of teachers who had high expectations, believed in their students, but they did not have critical awareness. And I want to make a point that this group represents the vast majority of our teachers out there. They have the best of intentions. They want their students to learn, but they lack a key understanding that we're seeing many efforts try to address. So these teachers also had students whose outcomes did not improve. And the question is why? They had high expectations. And if we look to other research, we know that when they don't have this key knowledge, few teachers develop it, right? They are susceptible to the deficit beliefs that we are all inundated with, right? And so this prevents them from sustaining the high expectations that they had at the beginning. In contrast, when teachers have this deep knowledge and high expectations, we see that students do phenomenally well in the course of just a year, right? They close gaps within a year, reading, mathematics, but not only achievement, but other areas that are part of the science of learning and development, like academic self-concept, ethnic identity, curiosity, self-direction, and instrumental to our conversation today, the motivation to learn about others. These students want to learn about people who are different than them. And this is a very important point to make, because when we look at the banning of ethnic studies in the Tucson Unified School District, it was promulgated on the notion that they were promoting hatred toward white people. And this is the same argument we're hearing with anti-CRT. My research and many others show the opposite to be true. In fact, if we look at the decades of research, Christine Sleeter's work, James Banks' work, it promotes the belonging of all students. And so the key takeaway in all this evidence is asset-based pedagogy helps address disparities and promotes both identity and achievement by leveraging all youth's assets. So I will stop my share.
Thank you, Francesca. That was wonderful. Now I'd like to introduce Zaretta Hammond, teacher, educator, and author of Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. Zaretta?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And Dr. Lopez really laid out what I think is a really powerful argument, if you will, if we need to argue for it, but certainly the evidence that shows that having that critical awareness, understanding the source of disparities is really important. I think where I continue to build on that type of foundation of critical awareness is when the boots are on the ground, where we're in the classroom, when we're talking about the instructional core, how are teachers marrying their belief, that high expectation, because they understand the source of these disparities. And there's nothing lacking in the student, right? In the child, in the family. That's the deficit model. But when we understand culturally responsive teaching as distinct from critical race theory, and this is a piece I think is really important because the acronym CRT and CRT get people really, really confused over what are we talking about. So one is that lens, that racial equity lens that we're looking at to understand what parts of the system, the structures, the policies, the practices keep resulting in chronic underachievement for historically marginalized students. So what do we do to reverse that? And that's the thing I try to help people really understand. Culturally responsive teaching is something that we use to really help them close those gaps when they can leverage the schema, the funds of knowledge that students come in with. So critical race theory is not a curriculum, just as Dr. Lopez laid out. Neither is culturally responsive teaching. There may be curricular parts to that, but it is not a packaged thing that talks about racial politics or a racial identity. Everything does not have to be racialized in order for it to still be culturally relevant and responsive to who the student is. It's building on the funds of knowledge, the community knowledge, the cultural assets that they bring to the classroom. Really, really important as we're in conversations with folks to help them distinguish between culturally responsive teaching, that CRT, and critical race theory, that CRT, which is the lens. If we don't understand that lens, then we are going to replicate some things that created these disparities. So that's a really important part. But the piece that I really want to talk about is, so what do we do when kids come to us, when our students come to us underperforming because of historically what we have done or allowed to flourish in school systems? Let's just take reading, for example. We can look across the nation and see chronically Black and Brown students are typically 2 to 3 grade levels behind. And as a result, when they move to higher grades, their ability to actually start to take in content through reading is going to be limited. But we also know that historically, there were anti-racism laws, that when we had segregation, that was an area where we underdeveloped students' capacity. The science of learning really is helpful as a way to understand what undergirds culturally responsive teaching, because as you can see in the slide that's on the screen, that environment is really about helping students leverage their understanding and meaning making of the content. Now, here's the thing. Culturally responsive teaching is really focused on building students' capacity to do deeper learning and take on more rigorous work. And how does that happen? Well, the science of teaching, which has these, 8 wonderful areas, I've just kind of plotted 3 of them on there. You can see the social and emotional dimensions of cognition are interrelated. You have to have a high trust, low stress environment, because you're going to want students to actually engage in information processing that leads to meaning making. So here's the thing that's so important. We have to have intellectual curiosity, meaning kids should not have to fear microaggressions because they are being made fun of according to the way they learn, that their funds of knowledge are not respected as part of the information that gets intertwined with new content, because we know in order to learn new content, it has to be coupled with your existing background knowledge. So being able to really understand this is really important. And right there in the middle is the malleability, that neuroplasticity. We can't get to deeper learning if that's not done. So, it's really important that we familiarize ourselves with the science of learning, because it goes hand in hand with culturally responsive teaching, which is really about that intellectual safety, intellectual curiosity, and being able to help students engage in productive struggle that does not penalize them for learning from their mistakes, from seeing errors as information. But when we don't understand kind of our own historical background, the systems that we've set up, then we are very likely to replicate these practices within the instructional core. So much to say about this. It was said before, so little time. But I really want people to get that on the ground, we really do have to understand that culture is the software to the brain's hardware. It is not synonymous with racial politics. And this is where teachers have to, we have to give them the information that builds their understanding of these, high emotional, high trigger words, right? There's nothing wrong with talking about culture. There's nothing wrong with talking about racial identity. That is not the same as calling someone racist, but all this is getting kind of mixed together. So really understanding the science of learning and how it intertwines with culturally responsive teaching, I think is really critical.
Thank you, Zaretta. So many gems. I know folks are already including some questions in the chat. But first, I'd actually like to introduce Aaron Spence, Superintendent of Virginia Beach City Public Schools. Aaron?
Hi, thanks, Ashley, and thank you, Francesca and Zaretta. It's just an honor to be on a panel with both of you. And I will try to translate, I think, to our work, what you're saying. You know, we obviously, I think, like most superintendents and most school districts across the country, are engaged in one way or another in this conversation about critical race theory. You know, we certainly have folks who have been coming to our school board and talking to them about their concerns about this. And it has been an interesting and sometimes frustrating struggle to help communicate first what the differences are, and then also really focus in on what we are doing and why we're doing it, to the points that both of you made. And one of the things that I think I would say from a practical perspective is what's more powerful for us is to talk a lot more about what we are doing and why we're doing it than to talk about what we're not doing, right? Because to the point, I mean, even as something as simple as saying that CRT equals this and CRT also equals this, and it's confusing to people. I mean, and what I find too is people have kind of hardened their position on this because they hear things over and over again in places where they go to get their information. And it doesn't matter if I say, hey, you know, we're not teaching critical race theory, because critical race theory has been equated with and conflated with so many other things like social and emotional learning and culturally responsive practices. And so our work, I think, in our schools and in our communities is to really shift the conversation to this asset-based kind of thinking about how we teach children and how children learn. And I really appreciate the information that you've shared about kind of the impact of that, the evidence base for creating the conditions for learning for children, and doing so by, I mean, I think essentially what it comes down to is doing so by knowing who our kids are and ensuring that our practices allow them to be seen, known, and heard in our classrooms. And it comes down to, for me, trying to create a place where children feel they belong. You know, we all in education talk about Bloom's taxonomy, and we often forget about Maslow's taxonomy. And we really need to start there when we're talking about why, I think we need to start there when we're talking about why we engage in practices that are asset-based for children, right? Why we engage in practices that are culturally responsive. And, you know, I mean, the idea is, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, beyond the physical needs of being safe and secure, you have to have belonging before you can take the next progression in terms of self-actualization. And you can't become a confident learner. And I think that's what you all are saying. The science says clearly, you can't become a confident and engaged learner if you don't feel like you're supposed to be in the room. And so for us and for our work, when we talk about this, what we really are talking about is how do you help teachers, help students feel like they're supposed to be in the room. And that is to the point of critical awareness. And I really appreciate you sort of pointing it out that way, because you're so right. I mean, I think there's so many times where teachers, without any ill intention, just aren't aware of who their children are and aren't aware of the assets they do bring because of the marvelous diversity of our children into our classrooms. And so don't engage in practices and strategies, specific practices and strategies to help children see themselves. I mean, things like curricular assessment, right? Like, what's in our curriculum? Do children see themselves in our curriculum? But also in our conversations and in the way that we engage in our conversations in our classrooms. And Ms. Hammond, your book, I will say, around culturally responsive practices in the brain, is something that we use and have talked about in our school district as a way to help people understand that neurological connection, that sense of belonging comes from knowing that you're known and that you're loved and cared for. And so for us, I think I agree. We don't spend enough time on this in schools of education. We need to have the knowledge to be able to address the disparities in education, and we need to do that from a scientific basis. And at its core, I think that does start with establishing the precursors for higher learning. And establishing the precursors for higher learning means that children have to feel like I'm supposed to be in the room. I will say, what's one of the difficult aspects of this is that, and I worry that we just summarily dismiss people who bring these concerns forward. Because, and I think there's kind of, as I said earlier, we harden our positions, and we're so sort of divided in this country. And so if somebody comes forward and says, well, you're teaching CRT and that's not okay, and I'm angry about it. And I'll be honest, sometimes my first reaction is to say, well, you don't even know what you're talking about. And that's not helpful. What's more helpful is to sort of pause and say, like, if I truly want to have an equity conversation, everybody has to stay in the room to have that conversation, right? If I just kick out people who don't agree with me, we're no longer having an equity conversation, right? We're kind of having that indoctrination conversation. And I want people in the room. And so, I wrote an op-ed about this recently where we really talked about the common ground is to find belonging. And the common ground is, everybody understands the desire to be in the room and to be seen and heard. And also then I think for schools, and I think maybe Ashley, you'll talk about this as you start to talk about communication strategies, is to not focus on what we don't teach. If people are hardened to what they think CRT is, me saying we don't teach CRT is not going to be helpful. Me saying, here's what we do teach, both from a curriculum standpoint. Yes, we're going to address racial identity, and we're going to address injustice in the curriculum, because in an intellectually honest and age-appropriate way, we have to be able to talk about those things, both through our literature studies and through our history and just the whole sum of the disciplines. And we want to make sure that we continue to do that in ways that bring everybody into the room for the conversation. So I'll pause there, and hopefully there are opportunities to talk more about this with everybody, because I've just been fascinated by this.
That is so wonderful, Aaron. And yes, I am going to jump in a little bit with some of what you just said. And I think, this conversation is so important. And so there are two things that I can offer from a communications perspective that can be a springboard for our Q&A. So if you can pull the slides back up real quickly. There's some good news and bad news here. We have seen this script before. It's just a different movie. In all of the work that we've done in communications over the decades, we've seen instances, for example, marriage equality, where there was preemptive legislation across the country before things were actually even happening. Coordinated efforts across the US, like we're seeing now, the opponents controlling the narrative, a clear, CRT has become this boogeyman villain. Like, we've seen that before. Broad misunderstanding of the key terms and policies, perpetuating a false choice between their kids and ours. And then in some cases, what maybe happened earlier this year, late last year, that the advocates in some cases really thought that this might blow over. And so people were either slow to react, slow to respond, or slow to take it seriously. And now, given what Bethany shared at the beginning about the legislation being passed across the country, it's real easy for us to all see now that there is, we can no longer ignore this, and we have to organize and coordinate to have a united front to get ahead of this and change the narrative. And so if you go to the next slide, this taps into some of what Aaron was just mentioning. There are some simple do's and don'ts I want to offer. Some of it you already heard here, but don't be defensive. That is actually not helpful. And when we think about our personal conversations and professional conversations, usually being defensive is kind of a non-starter for the conversation. Do ask clarifying questions to determine whether you're in a political conversation or a pedagogical one, but remain curious. If you think about, what Aaron said, if someone were to come up to you and accuse you of doing something, I've asked simple questions like, well, what does that mean to you? Or what makes you think that's true? And you can actually engage in a conversation to help them maybe on their own actually start to peel back the layers of what they're saying and reach a consensus that, oh, maybe I don't know as much about this as I thought, but at least it keeps the door open for a conversation. Don't assume most people understand what CRT or even equity is. We have done poll after poll after poll. Some people still conflate equity in the education space. If they hear it even in that context, they're assuming home equity. In other instances, you've got a difference between equity and equality. And so just again, don't assume that you know what the person knows, what their knowledge base is, or that they know what they're talking about. Something that we're seeing that does work is really leveraging youth voices and stories when showing why equity is necessary. Don't get trapped in a debate. However, do unapologetically share some examples of equitable practices in action. There's a few others here I want to share. Do appeal to shared values, so quality education being affirmed. I'm going to ask a question in a moment, but I've heard belonging, trust, stress, like these core human emotions, things that anyone can relate to, no matter who they are or where they come from. And to that regard, don't repeat the other side's negative framing when you're addressing the criticism. I think we've all seen this on TV before, but when someone asks an inherently flawed question and then the respondent repeats the flawed question, it actually perpetuates the narrative. So these are some really simple things. I know the slides are going to be available later, but I think last but not least, be intentional about messengers and don't apologize for advocating for students and listening to their needs. You're all doing such incredibly important work that you don't need to be apologizing for, and there are simple ways that you can open the door to conversations to find common ground. So with that, I'd like to move into some questions. And Erin, just on this topic about people having hardening their opinion, I'm curious if you can share some examples of when you've seen someone soften, and I'm kind of thinking about how often youth voices or children's voices and needs are overshadowed in the conversation, and how when adults encounter a young person actually speaking for themselves or their needs being elevated, sometimes there can be some softening. So are there any examples you'd want to share with the group about how you've seen people maybe soften their perspective?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, at the superintendent level, a lot of where I'm engaged is at the political level. And what I find right now at the political level is there's not as much softening. And so what I try to do is kind of work behind the scenes with folks, and to your point, kind of have those curious questions, so tell me what you think that really means. And let me talk you through what we're actually doing, and see if what we're actually doing resonates with you more than what you think we're doing. I mean, I've taken a public position. I've taken a public position a few different times and in a few different ways, trying not to be defensive about the work, but trying to really say, hey, there's common ground here. That there's, to one of your points, look for the common ground. Well, the common ground says, well, what do we all want for kids? And if we can agree on what we all want for kids, which is that they feel safe and loved and cared for, and that they're learning at a high level because we've established those precursors for learning. I mean, if you can get people to agree to that, then we can talk about, well, okay, so here's the things we're doing to accomplish that. And then people will come around. I have found that there are times when and I think I saw a little bit of that over in the chat, like there are times when you give a very thoughtful, passionate response to somebody who really wants to engage with you, and it's just dismissed. And I do think there's a place for your own self-preservation where you have to say, okay, I'm going to acknowledge that you're where you are right now. I'm going to bring you along later because I'm going to show you empirically that what I'm doing is working for kids. And hopefully when you see that, we'll be in a better place. And I will say the other part of this, a lot of these folks are parents. A lot of them aren't, but the ones that are, where I win in these conversations with them, where I see the softening, it's not a win, right? Where I see the softening is when I say, well, tell me where it's happened with your child. Give me a concrete example of where you've seen this thing. Because a lot of what we're hearing, I mean, we're sort of beating around the bush, but what we really hear a lot of are parents who come in and say, you are making my child feel ashamed of being white, and I won't stand for that. And so, you know, where I engage with that in a more private way, I can't do it at a board meeting, but in a more private way is to say, well, can you tell me where that's really happened with your child? And an example where a teacher has done that, or how that's occurred. And it's led to some interesting conversation. And I know I'm a long answer, and I'll be really fast. I'll wrap this up. But like, the one thing we've heard a lot, and I've heard it across the country, is this story about a kid who goes home and says, you know, mommy, I'm white, but I'm not mean. And they come home from school with that. And you know, when you dive into that a little deeper, you know, what's usually acknowledged, well, I don't know what the lesson was that created that moment. And I think, well, okay, that's a great opportunity as a parent to explore that, like to find out, was there an inappropriate lesson, or was there like a really age appropriate lesson on something like Jim Crow or the civil rights movement, and a child has internalized that on their own, and it's an opportunity to really talk to that child. Well, of course, you're a wonderful human being, and why do you think those things happened, and what do you think you can do about that as a part of our community? And when I engage with parents that way, what I find is that they really do want their child to be able to have those experiences and those conversations. That what they don't want is for their child to be told there's something wrong with you. And when we can give them the assurance that that's not what we're doing, we can usually get to the other side of this.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Oh, go ahead, Zaretta.
I want to piggyback on that, because this point that Erin makes about parents and helping them soften, and I love that terminology, right? It is the idea that, you know, when they have a fuller picture, they start to understand. And one of the things that is really true, and I know this from raising my own children and being a parent, and having to see the racial literacy of some of our white parents in the school where my children attended, you know, independent school, predominantly white. And it was really clear that white parents don't necessarily have those conversations about racial identity early on, and they don't necessarily give their children language just to navigate the world, not necessarily talking about racial politics, but, you know, shades of brown, and how can you acknowledge brown in an affirming way, and the small questions that young children ask that build that capacity. Because there's something different between having empathy when you hear someone else's story of struggle and feeling bad about yourself. And if we don't really support parents to come together, not, you know, telling them they're wrong to want to shut something down that's going to make their child feel bad, but to create a space where they actually can start to say, how do I have those conversations with my child? Because we do live in a multiracial, multilingual, you know, multicultural society, and that is not going to change.
Yeah, just on that note, there's a question here about what does culturally responsive teaching look like in predominantly white classrooms? The assumption is that the emphasis might shift to understanding whiteness and equality, but just curious, have you all, any of you, thought about this? Doretta, some of what you just said connected this for me to you, but any of you can address this. What does it look like in predominantly white classrooms?
I'll jump in. When I'm working with schools and teams, we're really talking about how do we help students that are historically been marginalized and their cognition underdeveloped? How do we help them become cognitively independent learners? Now, the reality is, if we're talking about having awareness of our racial history in predominantly white schools, that may not be culturally responsive teaching that they need. And this is where I think some of the tension in our misunderstanding of what it is actually applies. So there, I would call that anti-racist education, right? How do you understand? This is what ethnic studies is designed to do. So you have a fuller sense of the historical antecedents in your own country, in your own community, in your own, we could just take Tulsa, right? Everybody now understands about Black Wall Street. Then it's like, oh, did we have a Tulsa in our own community? And now people can start to talk about, wow, what is the history? What have been the covenants in housing? How does redlining happen? So now this is a richer understanding of their own context. It's not to vilify anyone, but I do think that that Anti-racist education is more suited for all white environments, because now you're talking about how do you do that? Because here's the reality. All instruction is culturally responsive. And the question is, whose culture is it already being responsive to? So culture is not something that just folks of color have. White folk have culture too. All brains need it. That's how it organizes. So the way we keep talking about culturally responsive teaching as if it is ethnic studies, I think really underplays the science of learning aspect, its ability to help us accelerate learning for students who have been left behind in terms of their ability to carry more of the cognitive load and take on more rigorous instruction.
I think that I agree with just about everything said, and I'd add, when I've worked with school districts who have that demographic, right, predominantly white students, some of them deal with issues like Native American mascots, and you see these tensions then bubble up because you've got a clash in the community where you have students who have become aware and engaged in anti-racist knowledge, maybe not through school, but through other resources, and suddenly are bringing the attention and the conversations up to bear, right? And when I was asked, why should these students learn about other students? I often say, when we are helping our students become prepared for a lifelong learning endeavor, right? And we want them to go to university, college, have that option. We want them to be prepared to be with students who don't look like them, because that's what happens the moment you leave and you go somewhere else, or even workforce, right? You are going to work with people who have different backgrounds. How do we ensure people can navigate that space, right? So it's a really interesting conversation, and there are many names, and often, even Gloria Latson-Billings has come out and said people call something culturally relevant. I've seen it and it's not. Learning, and there were questions in the chat about, yes, it is about learning accurate history, accurate accounts, the roles played, and that knowledge becomes power, right? To be able to become a productive, responsible, knowledgeable human being. And when I mentioned critical awareness, culturally relevant pedagogy actually engages in such a way, so does anti-racist education, to ensure that students develop critical awareness, that they know history, that they know how to navigate this, so that they can understand why we are in the space that we are in today. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So I'm trying to keep up with the chat, and I'm gonna maybe surface a couple of questions to get a finer point on a few things. One question is, how do we explain to others that culturally responsive pedagogy is not the same as critical race theory? There's a general sense of offense to critical race theory for the community that I reside in. I imagine this is true for many people. I think my answer to that would be different than yours, maybe, Francesca. So perhaps do you want to start, and then others can jump in?
Could you rephrase the question one more time? I got distracted.
The first part. Oh yeah, sure. The first part is, how do we explain to others that culturally responsive pedagogy is not the same as critical race theory?
Yeah, that's difficult, because I do agree with the point you raised about we don't say, right, the negative of it. I think what Aaron referred to, Superintendent Spence referred to as the strategy, it resonated. And it's what I've seen school leaders do very successfully. This is how we define equity. These are the things we're doing. What elements of it do you disagree with? Because then it positions, we want to cultivate that every single child or adolescent that walks into our schools feels like they belong, sees themselves in the curriculum, engages in critical thinking. Do you disagree with any of that? So I believe the strategy is not going into the rabbit hole of what CRT is or isn't, because I think that that's kind of a trap, but it's rather, this is what we're doing to address the things that we deem important. And I've seen that be very successful, and it sometimes shuts down the detracting conversations. That said, I don't want to make my comments seem that I disagree at all with Superintendent Spence's comments about engaging with parents and concerns. Those are legitimate. I've had a school district call and say, somebody did the brown eye, blue eye study in our classroom. Not okay. That would never fly in a higher education institution as far as okay for psychological development, because of the trauma that children can face. There are some things you would not do in classrooms and some things that are absolutely okay. So that's how I think we engage. I think Superintendent Spence named the strategy that I totally advocate.
And if I could just layer into that, I think one of the really important parts of this is to not be defensive when we don't do things right. You know,
That's
to
right.
your point about somebody calls and says, well, they did this study or they used this video that was really offensive in this way. And if you look at it and you can see why it's like it's declarative language and it pushes people out of the room, to not say, you know, well, I'm digging my heels in and we're going to keep using that. But to say, you know what, that isn't our goal. And if that's keeping you from entering into this conversation with us, then we're going to set that aside and find something else, another way to get you into this conversation with us. And I think that that really matters as well, you know, trying to keep that in mind. And I would say again, this whole notion of how, you know, how do you help people understand these differences? I just think you really can't focus on that. I think you can't spend your time trying to say what critical race theory is not, because it's so, I mean, it's just so been so conflated with other things right now. And I mean, I think over time, that education through efforts like this and a lot of the work that people are doing to kind of get out there and say, look, this is what critical race theory is, this is what it's not, will help. But when you're in that moment and you're in that conversation with somebody, it's just way better to pivot and go, here's what we are looking at, here's what we are working on, and here's what's important to us. And I'll just add this one other thing. If you can frame it in the skill sets that people need to be successful, right? So Francesca was talking about this a little bit. You know, children need to be able to, in age appropriate ways, have controversial discussions, you know, discussions about controversial topics, things that are difficult. They need to be able to process that, to be able to form their own opinions, to think critically, to see things more globally, to understand the ability to grow and understand who other people are. And I love that slide that said kids want to know who other people are and understand them. And, you know, like social and emotional learning right now is the new one that's been tagged in as critical race theory, right? So, and I mean, that just boggles the mind when you think about the skills and knowledge that social and emotional learning is concerned with around like cognitive development and emotional regulation and making responsible decisions. And when you think about like, what do employers tell school systems they want all the time, right? What do they tell higher education that they're looking for? They are looking for that set of skills. They're looking for kids who can think critically, have empathy, work with others well, understand people, and be able to, you know, to regulate their own emotions and manage themselves in a way to be successful in an environment. And then we're going to start talking about those are bad things. So the more we can make the connection to those things are the things that are really good and that people want, I think the better off we're going to be.
I want to piggyback on, or not necessarily piggyback, but contribute and agree with everything that was laid out. But I also want to remind us where the science of learning fits in, because there is a social harmony part, right? Being able to work with others, get along, understand about others. Then we also see where there are chronic underachievement in particular groups. How do we get students to accelerate that learning? And that's where, to me, when you're leveraging the funds of knowledge, the schema that our children come in, those are their assets, with what we understand about how you help them engage in productive struggle. You got to get okay with making mistakes. Errors become information. You've got to have feedback loops. Those are not the social harmony part of what we're talking about, and we have a tendency to ignore that. So even though we know students are behind, you know, chronically, if they're Black and brown, if they're living in certain zip codes, then we also have to understand the instructional aspects of being able to close those learning gaps for students. There is the thing about helping folks get along, but there is a whole different piece that is equally, if not more important at some point, that I can get along with folks, but if I'm still reading 3 grade levels behind when I graduate, guess what's going to happen? So it's not an either or, it's a both and we don't want to get so trapped up into this idea that, you know, we're talking about race, racial politics, that we forget we have to empower students so that they have a type of liberatory education that allows them to have choice. I can go to university, I can go into a career. I have those choices, but if my skills are underdeveloped, if I don't have information processing ease, if I cannot read and write on grade level, and you know, this means we're not teaching a 5-paragraph essay in 12th grade, like friends don't let friends do that. And so the reality is we have to level up the learning. This is where the science of learning, to me, sometimes gets lost in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also curious, there's a question about high trust and low stress. And as I was thinking about this conversation, that also came to my mind. Those are universal human emotions, feelings, etc. We all have them no matter how old we are. So can you talk a little bit about the distinction between those high trust, low stress learning environments and how culturally responsive teaching that, helps create critical awareness may cause some discomfort, but it's important discomfort to have and learn and move through. Can
Right.
you talk about the high
Yeah.
trust, low stress, and culturally responsive?
I want to continue to distinguish between having controversial conversations and culturally responsive practice. Those two are not the same. It can encompass that, but as I just said, sometimes culturally responsive teaching is about how do I learn this new content by leveraging what I already bring in an asset. Our children aren't coming in as blank slates. So the idea of having a trust, low stress environment means if I want students to engage in productive struggle, or if I want them to engage in controversial conversations, I have to create an environment. There has to be a community of learners where we have agreements about how we are. That sense of belonging has to be thick. And listen, competence is a trust builder. If the student does not feel intellectually safe because the way in which microaggressions might be popping off and nobody's checking that and they're looking at the teacher like, you're going to let them just say that about my accent? Yep. And if that happens, shutdown happens. So we want students to engage. We want these things to happen, but that means you've created the psychological environment. So we can't just say relationships and belonging as if those were magic. They're not. They are actually things as humans we work to develop. You don't immediately trust someone. Trust is something that's earned through knowing them, knowing their story, being able to create an environment that if there's a violation, then there is a restoration. There's a way in which we have agreements, the way we move through our community of learning. So the high trust, low stress doesn't stand in contrast to talk about controversial subjects. It actually has to be the bedrock. So that if you don't have that, there's no way in hell you're going to talk about anything controversial, because it's all going to go sideways. Somebody's going to leave crying, and then your class going to get shut down. Well, how is that? Because you did not do that work of building relational trust in that classroom so they know they had each other's back. So when we're talking about this is not about racial narratives running amok or someone microaggressions popping off, that we've learned to be in harmony. And that should start in first grade, kindergarten. So it is built up as this is how we respect ourselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, the parallels of how we engage in our own relationships, our own family of origin, our own friends. If it's a trusted relationship, you can have some difficult conversations and you're going to make it through. If there's no trust, those conversations are a non-starter. So why would we assume our young people can do better than what we would even expect for ourselves?
And here's actually the other thing I would add to that. I don't want us to leave the fact that that trust is as necessary when I ask students to engage in productive struggle. When you are behind and what you're saying to yourself as a learner, I'm stupid because someone told me because of my gender, because of my race, because of my ethnicity, that I'm stupid, then that's going to impede your ability to actually engage in it. So that trust has to be the ability to have a counter narrative and rewrite that self-talk. So I want to keep going back to the science of learning, because there's one thing again about just the relational, everybody getting along. This is not just about kumbaya. This is about I can leverage and level up my cognition, and that is going to increase my relational awareness. And that's back to what Dr. Lopez said, that critical awareness becomes really an important asset.
Wonderful. So I think we'll move to final thoughts. We'll start with you, Francesca, and then maybe we'll wrap up with you, Dr. Spence.
Final thoughts. This is such an important conversation, and I was thrilled to be part of it. Clearly, there are some points that are very important as a strategy. I mean, communication, knowing what culturally responsive, teaching actually is, how to engage with parents, and I think ultimately what we all shared in today's panel is that there are core things like belonging, taking the benefit of the doubts of parents' concerns. As a parent myself, we understand that there can be legitimate concerns and not just writing those off to a political spectacle. And I think, pedagogy and knowledge that seeks to really understand and view youth in our classrooms as assets and that they need to see themselves and feel that they belong is ultimately the goal. And I think the message that we all collectively share, and it's based on the science of learning. So those are my parting thoughts.
And I think just quickly, my parting thought is one of gratitude. Humbled to be on a panel with these minds and to really hear you all affirming our perspective on the work that we have to do, and that we are working at, and that we find, and I'm sure a lot of the folks who are in this room with us find it to be a struggle, but kind of a magnificent struggle as we celebrate the amazing diversity of the kids that we work with, and look for ways to help them all be ready for the world that we want them to be ready for.
Wonderful way to wrap up. Thank you all so much for your brilliance, and everyone who joined us. Thank you so much for your time. We will get through this and we will come out of it better and stronger on the other side. Thank you all and have a good day.